More than 30,000 Chinese peacekeepers have served as part of United Nations forces since China began participating in UN peacekeeping missions in 1990. China is now the largest contributor of UN peacekeepers among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And China also plays a major role in funding UN peacekeeping operations. Among our guests is the Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping with the UN. But we begin with Wang Guan. He is our chief political correspondent with CCTV's Mandarin service, and he joins us from the newsroom. Wang Guan, good to see you. What can you tell us about the current level of China's involvement in UN peacekeeping? Where are they deployed, and what type of missions are they engaged in? Because we've seen a lot of involvement since 1990, haven't we?
Right, Nathan. According to the United Nations, at least 2,600 Chinese troops are currently serving in the UN peacekeeping missions. The vast majority of them are based in the West and East African countries. Those in South Sudan and Liberia make up half of China's peacekeepers. 400 Chinese troops are stationed along Israel-Lebanon border in the Middle East, and 400 more scattered in 9 hotspot regions across the globe. Let's put the numbers in perspective, Nathan. In 2003, China contributed 260 UN peacekeepers. Now, 10 times that many. They're mainly doing 3 things: peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. These are, of course, 3 different things. For peacemaking, they go to active combat zones such as South Sudan to stop the government and rebel groups from fighting each other. For peacekeeping, they remain in conflict zones when active combats are over to preserve a ceasefire. Peace building is the challenging part. These Chinese troops, along with troops from other countries, work with national and local law enforcement agencies to build law and order institutions. There are Chinese engineers to help build infrastructures in Mali, medical teams to fight Ebola in Liberia, and mine-sweeping teams in Lebanon.
Wang Guan, also China back at UNHQ is making major contributions to the funding of UN peacekeeping. The UN obviously welcomed China's support for future peacekeeping efforts. What can you tell us about that?
Well, China currently contributes to 10% of the UN peacekeeping budget. That makes Beijing the 2nd largest donor behind the United States. Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged to train 8,000 additional troops to act as reserve, so whenever and wherever needed, those peacekeepers of China can be dispatched. So when China announced a 300,000 troops cut last year to make its domestic forces more nimble, they're actually increasing their share of their international peacekeeping troops to the United Nations.
Obviously, peacekeeping comes with risks, and China has lost peacekeepers this year. What sort of sacrifices has China suffered during its peacekeeping operations?
Well, according to the Chinese military, at least 13 Chinese soldiers have been killed during UN peacekeeping missions in the past 2 decades. Notably, 2 of them were killed in July this year during fighting between rebels and government troops in South Sudan. The UN recognizes China's sacrifice. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said this July that he thinks China has played a leading role in UN peacekeeping, international development, and combating epidemic diseases. China may not be as big as international development as some powerhouses such as the US, not yet, but it is certainly going in that direction.
Wang Guan from our newsroom, thanks so much. Joining me now from the United Nations headquarters in New York is Ghassim Wane. He is Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations with the United Nations. Welcome to the show, sir. First of all, I'd like to ask you from the UN's perspective, what has been the increased contributions of China in terms of men, material, and of course, money meant for the international organization?
Oh, thank you. Happy to join you. China is an important contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping. China ranked number 12 out of over 120 peacekeeping contributing countries, troop contributing countries, and police contributing countries. We have over 2,600 Chinese uniformed personnel in our peacekeeping missions, in 10 out of 16 peacekeeping missions in Africa, of course, with UNAMID in Darfur, UNMISS in South Sudan, UNMIL in Liberia, MINURSO in Western Sahara, MONUSCO in the DRC. We also have Chinese peacekeepers in Europe, in FICIP, in limited number, and in the Middle East, in UNIFIL in particular, and in UNSTO. And they do, of course, make a huge contribution to our operations, performing in a very satisfactory manner, efficiently and effectively, and that has been shown in a number of theaters. But China also does contribute a number of assets that are critical to the success of peacekeeping, medical doctors, of course, in terms of medical support, engineering, and transportation. And I would like to add that Chinese contribution also includes support to the training of foreign peacekeepers, 2,000. They have committed themselves to training over 2,000 peacekeepers. That includes contribution to the African Union standby force with a contribution of $100 million. And I also would like to add that China has pledged foreign police unit as part of the follow-up to the Leaders Summit on Peacekeeping, as well as the establishment of a standby peacekeeping force of 8,000 strong personnel. So it's a huge, important contribution to United Nations peacekeeping, which is very much appreciated.
It's been a bit of an evolution, hasn't it? When China first got involved in peacekeeping in the 1990s, generally would deploy observers. We saw in Liberia a lot of engineering crews helping rebuild bridges, schools and the like. But then if you fast forward to today and South Sudan deploying their first combat infantry unit, 700 personnel. So what's the evolution been like in terms of the UN, and how has it helped with all these missions?
Well, indeed, it has been an evolution and an increasing contribution by China, as shown not only by actual contribution on the ground in the peacekeeping missions I listed, but also by pledges within the framework of our peacekeeping capability readiness system. And you did make reference to South Sudan, where indeed China has deployed its combat unit for the first time ever. And they performed extremely well and are contributing, of course, to our efforts aimed at creating the space required for a lasting resolution to the conflict in South Sudan. And as you know, unfortunately, Chinese peacekeepers were among those who were injured, and 2 of them were killed in the course of the fighting that took place in Juba, South Sudan, in first part of July. Chinese peacekeepers, unfortunately, were also killed in Mali, and I would like to reiterate our condolences to the Chinese people and government. But those sacrifices are a clear testament to the Chinese commitment to the United Nations peacekeeping, which, as you know, is a multilateral endeavor that can only succeed if we get the support of member states, and China has been one of our strongest supporters.
And as a member of the P5, it also sets an example, obviously.
Absolutely.
I want to just talk to you about the evolution of peacekeeping itself. Peacekeeping, of course, has gone through lots of different phases. There have been lots of soul-searching when missions don't go right, as in the former Yugoslavia, and the reluctance to get involved in Rwanda. But it's also difficult to get troops on the ground during crises when they break out so quickly. So as you are evolving the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, it's very important to have these rapid reaction standby forces. As you mentioned, China has 8,000, is going to be deploying that. How does that fit in with this new view of a more quickly deployable force that can do a lot more with perhaps a lot less manpower?
I think you rightly pointed out the evolution of peacekeeping. And let me just maybe, before responding directly to your question, start by highlighting how relevant peacekeeping is today as a multilateral collective tool to address peace and security challenges across the globe. As you know, we do have 16 peacekeeping operations, over 120,000 peacekeepers, military, police, and civilian personnel who are deployed in a number of member states. And they operate, of course, in increasingly challenging environment where we face asymmetric threat. We have seen it in Mali. They operate in contexts in which member states' consent is at times quite difficult to secure in practical terms, in terms of cooperation with our peacekeepers for them to perform their mandate. And they operate also with resources that are not always adequate. And we can see it in a number of peacekeeping operations where, unfortunately, we lack critical assets. And over the past few years, we have been making tremendous efforts to improve, to enhance the effectiveness of our peacekeeping operations. And the Leaders Summit and the peacekeeping readiness system to which you refer to is part of the process. And China made a pledge of 8,000 uniformed personnel, military personnel, to contribute to that system, and efforts are underway to assess the readiness of those units and to get them at the appropriate level. And of course, the existence of such type of arrangement make it much more easier for us to deploy quickly whenever needed.
Ghassim Wane, thank you so much for joining us from United Nations headquarters. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll be joined by an international panel as we take a closer look at China's contribution to UN peacekeeping efforts. Please stay with us here on The Heat.